all black everything, all black, you know, all black in the name of all my black heroes, all black everything, all black polos, all black medallions, yeah, all black, yo.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We are joined today by Professor Jordanna Matlon, assistant professor in the School of International Service at American University. She is the author of A Man Among Other Men, The Crisis of Black Masculinity and Racial Capitalism, which was published by Cornell University Press in 2022. How are you doing today, Professor Matlon?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for this invitation.
So let me start with, how you began thinking about this project and what took you to Abidjan.
I actually began thinking about the kind of framework of the project from having done fieldwork in Abidjan. So it's almost a reverse story. So Abidjan is the economic and administrative capital of Côte d'Ivoire, and I say Côte d'Ivoire instead of Ivory Coast because the government of the country requests that people use the French term. It has not actually been the capital since the official capital since the 80s, but it's the de facto capital. The urban periphery is so large. There's been so much expansion outside of the core. That said, the core is quite famous. So certainly as a child in West Africa and before I was in Côte d'Ivoire, I was actually in Burkina Faso. And it was the Paris of West Africa. It was the place that was the beautiful skyline, the high-rise buildings. In fact, Plateau, which is it's a city of lagoons, is known as the Little Manhattan. So it's the Paris of West Africa, but then there's the Little Manhattan. It's a major migrant hub. It draws people from all over West Africa. It has a thriving social scene, and it's certainly now that the war has ended, it has one of the fastest growing economies, at least the country in the world. It's growing very fast and very unequal, like Ghana, like Nigeria. So you have a proliferating informality at the same time as you have malls where milkshakes cost $12, right? You have that at the same time. I was interested in going to Côte d'Ivoire to do my fieldwork for biographical reasons. That in my childhood, I had actually lived in Côte d'Ivoire. And there was a conflict after I graduated from undergrad, before I applied for a PhD. And it was a civil war splitting the country between North and South. And the city where I'd lived in the North was actually, it became the rebel capital. So I wanted to learn more about it. And my original idea was actually to look at immigration issues. But when I got there, because that was what, the conflict was about, Northerners coming to the South and issues like that. When I got there, what I found was similar to many of the immigration issues we have in the United States. It was a problem of work, that there weren't enough jobs, that there was an economic crisis, the informal economy was massive. And what I found from a sociological lens was that many of these issues affected men differently. In that it affected masculine identity. So it was certainly a crisis for everyone. And it was a crisis for women, a crisis for children, but it was not a crisis of femininity. To be a woman was not to be a breadwinner in these kinds of structures of capitalism. So that's what got me thinking about the framework. So I started with the site, and then the ideas came later. And I will add to that when I was there and when I started to read the literature, I found striking parallels with the literature on underemployment and crises of work for Black men in the United States. And that was much more what I did my undergraduate studies on, as an urban studies and sociology major. So also seeing those connections made me think globally.
You begin the book talking about this Guinness ad. And as I'm just remembering myself as a teenager and a college student, and the number of my Jamaican American peers who went on and on about Guinness Stout, it almost feels like, Guinness is this uniquely transnational Black male alcoholic beverage. But you begin with this ad and you talk about the interesting ways in which the symbol of Guinness and all these men and their proximity to it, it gave them a sense of manhood. Could you unpack that? First the ad and why it resonated with you, and what that particular ad says about the things that you talk about throughout your book.
Absolutely. And I could pull out a picture if that would interest. Should I? This is
Yes.
the advertisement in the book. So absolutely. And when I saw that advertisement, when I was doing my field work, I thought, this is my book. I don't need to write a book. I just need to take this picture. I wrote the book anyway. But I also have an article actually about Guinness in Africa, because it is really interesting. I'm not as familiar with Jamaica, but Guinness has a huge presence and has for a very long time, that traces back to imperial circuits. As a presence in Africa. So the Guinness ad, to unpack it for the audience, is 8 men who are dressed in, if you look at them, in different attire that indicate certain professions. So you have a DJ, you have a doctor, you have an engineer, a mechanic, these kinds of things. And they are standing there, and then there's a man with jeans and t-shirt, and he's holding a banner. And the banner says "Il y a de la greatness in chaque homme," which French and English, but the French part, there is greatness in each man. And so the man, it's for me striking that the man who had this banner and he's standing next to a life-size Guinness bottle is not dressed in any profession. He's just an everyday man. And so there's no indication that he's inserted into, for example, the wage economy. And this was a space in Abidjan that was a very popular corner or route for street vendors, men who would come in the road in between traffic to sell things. And it, to me, it mimicked these men who had no demarcated job, but it was giving them value, bestowing them with value, the banner of greatness, by being aligned with the brand, with the Guinness beer. And that spoke to all kinds of things about what it means to assert value, and relationships of commodification and different layers of commodification for Black men in the capitalist economy, relations to brands and relations to work.
There's a way when you first see that image, and particularly as you just explained it almost feels on the surface something egalitarian about it. But one of the ways that you pivot from that moment in the image is really to talk about the ways that Black men historically have been connected to notions of masculinity broadly and to notions of wage labor. And in some ways, you suggest that this image is really the byproduct of a larger crisis of labor, right? The ability to find work for Black men, and how the larger society thinks about Black men in relationship to patriarchy and manhood.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, one thing I write about in the book is this idea of a double commodification. So the commodification, both from that insertion into the slave economy, the commodification as property, as labor, as super exploited laborers, but also the commodification of branding, right? And of course, there's a relationship there, right? The ability to have commodities versus the ability versus being a commodity, right? So these are both very long legacies, and I do think that they dovetail in an image like that Guinness ad.
You write early in the book that the book advances the theory of racial capitalism by examining the hegemonic imaginaries that channel how Black men insert themselves as active subjects in the global economy. Unpack that for I hear that phrase and all my antennas go off, and I'm like, yes, right. But could you unpack that a little bit for our audience?
Right. So the idea of being active, and I think when you make arguments like this, you want to be really careful not to reproduce certain negations. So certainly to say that Black men were not participating in the global economy would be misleading. It would certainly be more of a traditional Marxist. The proletariat is the one who leads the revolution, and they're the subjects of history. When in fact, speaking back to those narratives is the role of colonized, racially marginalized populations. So definitely active in the economy, but not on their own accord. Right. So the labor was taken from them. So that's one point. And then as far as the hegemonic imaginaries is one thing I explore quite in depth as a frame that then leads me to explore other things is the role of the breadwinner. Right. So Black men's relationship to breadwinning as that this was established as the dominant form of patriarchy. And this was the patriarchal dividend that was even promised as part of the quote unquote civilizing mission, shall we say sick, right? The civilizing mission, that if you are going to be evolved like us, and that was a term that was also used to be evoluer, to be evolved, you would become a wage laborer in order to become a breadwinner. This is, and it was speaking from the African continent, but we see all of the parallels. I don't think I even need to say that, right? And at the same time, the opportunity, because of the insertion of Black men in capitalism, and I'll say racial capitalism, made that literally impossible. It was structurally impossible for most men to achieve that, which meant that structurally most men became failures. And then what does that mean to both want that patriarchal dividend, so to accept those terms, but then to accept those terms as being subjugated? And on top of that, what are the alternatives? Because there have always been alternatives. And the role of the entrepreneur, for example, which is certainly celebrated in neoliberal capitalism, and be it an entrepreneur in business or an entrepreneur as a musician or as an athlete, right? But ways to get around the kind of the wage laboring, breadwinning ideology of the working man, right? From 9 to 5. This is something that Black men, to be successful, had to do. And so there's also a glorification now of these ways of being in neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalism, where work is disappearing, work as we think of it. So there's also a glorification of those imaginaries and their own form of hegemony. So lots of layers there.
When you talk about this kind of centering of the Black male entrepreneur, and you mentioned all the obvious ways that we think about in terms of musicians, athletes, and I would add the drug dealer to this, right? So even if there's a clear critique of what a drug dealer might be peddling, at the same time, there's almost a celebration of this kind of entrepreneurial spirit that's at the basis of that, particularly if it translates into something that the community might think of as having value. You begin the book talking about this ad for Guinness, and you reference throughout the book the role of obviously advertising culture, but popular culture in general. Can you talk about the way, and you specifically talk about the moment, in the early 90s, thinking about it from a Gilroy perspective in the Black Atlantic, right? We begin to kind of celebrate these diasporic Black men, right? Who exist, who are successful, who are entrepreneurs, who are making connections with their, brethren in the US. How important is popular culture as a site of reproducing this notion of the evolved man?
Oh, that's a good question. So thank you. I think it is a reinterpretation, right? It's a taking ownership, but still the idea of being evolved is in very material ways the idea of participating, right? In capitalism on your own terms. And someone like Bell Hooks has written about By Any Means Necessary, right? That and talks about the gangsta as being, this is an elevation when it's just about money making the man, right? That it invites more Black men to join in the game. So if you're thinking about different metrics for right, judging what it means to be evolved. One is certainly I work in the civil service, which was kind of the main way that you became évolué in African cities during the 20th century was, and then in some way you were most likely an interlocutor to global capital or to the former colonial regime, right? That's a simplification, but certainly at least during colonialism, right? To be a civil servant was to be an interlocutor of the colonial regime. And then upon independence, we could talk about Frantz Fanon, right? It gets more complicated, but certainly there were elements there. But then there's another way, and it's through consuming, right? It's as a consumer. And the role of popular culture, it's incredibly seductive because there, and certainly we can say these models of Black masculinity have been crossing the Atlantic for a long, long time, right? I mentioned Jack Johnson at one point as kind of being a very early precursor to this, the Black man that you see in sports today and kind of the lavish consumer and right, really showy and all of that. So that's been happening for a long time, but there is something about the media circuits and that coinciding with very marginalized men in African cities as a consequence of structural adjustment and the debt crisis that are looking for these models and in fact bypassing their states as well. So what different authors have talked about is a ghetto imaginary that crosses borders, that the men in Abidjan, they had been kind of forgotten by the elites of Côte d'Ivoire, men in Dakar, men in Lagos, right, have been forgotten by the elites of Senegal, of Nigeria, and they're seeing these imaginaries that are speaking their language, right? They're seeing them cross the Atlantic. And so I do think that it's important to recognize the long circuits of transatlantic feedback, but also what is notable about, as you mentioned, the 90s, the late 90s on after the debt crisis, and really with the speeding up of seeing music videos, of seeing all of these, circuits come their way.
I immediately I'm thinking about, the way something like Jay-Z and Kanye's Niggas in Paris circulated, right? In a particular moment as the two of them being representative of some sort of notion of wealth accumulation within the context of this economy. I do want to ask, how aware are some of the men in Abidjan of this process, right? Of their investments in the things, in the imaginaries that they're invested in, of the limited stakes in terms of what their real opportunities are in the absence of wage labor?
It's a painful question, right? Yeah, because it's about confronting stasis. So there was a social demarcator of men who were underemployed and also this proxy of marriageability. If you weren't married, that was a more kind of pre-colonial merging with the colonial idea of being a man was the wealth in people, right? So if you have children, are you married? And are your children right through marriage? So without that, they were known as youth, So there's a lot of discussion about African youth, and it's not just, there is a youth bulge in African cities that demographers are interested in, but there's also a social category of youth that men were in their 40s and they talked about, we are the youth, right? La jeunesse, they called themselves. And so there's something that you don't want to look in the mirror and say that this is where I am, right? So there was always the I don't know if I want to call it cognitive dissonance or just hope, right? That at the end of any interview I would conduct with street vendors, I would say, where will you be in next year? Where will you be in 5 years? Where will you be in 10 years? And next year, yeah, they were realistic. This is where we'll be. In 10 years, they were always going to have something else, right? Even if they'd been there 10 years, even if the economy was in the middle of a civil war, even if, right, all of these factors working against them, but they weren't going to be there, and I spoke to a young man who had been a footballer, a soccer player for a team in Togo, a national team, and then he had to return because he had a sick father. And he was saying, I can still get signed by a European team in my 30s. That's not unheard of. It can happen, and so there was, I think that for the men themselves, you don't want, again, to be confined to stasis, and you refuse to believe it. And perhaps that's not a bad thing, right? To maintain that hope, but there was something tragic from my perspective, seeing them and knowing realistically most would not be where they wanted to be.
You talk in the book about Abidjan being thought of in its earliest days as kind of the Paris of Africa. And I raise that point, given even you discussing your early entry point into this work was looking at immigration patterns. For how many of this men, is there in their mind the idea that the best evolved man they can be is in Abidjan? And why aren't they thinking about necessarily moving, to other places to be able to apply their wares, right, or their talents, their skills, et cetera?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they were certainly thinking about moving, but not to apply their wares, right? Maybe if they talked about being businessmen, and they, these were very kind of nebulous ideas of what it was to be a businessman. It was often import export, right? It was hard to have a conversation with anyone for an extended period of time without a question about, who do you know at the U.S. Embassy? What contacts do you have? How can I get there? Certainly the numbers speak for themselves about people migrating, right? Doing the long journey north through the desert or across an ocean. So, and then across an ocean, right? But many tragedies there as well. So this was what one scholar, I quote Sasha Newell, who he calls it a stepping stone. Abidjan was known as a stepping stone, but it was also a regional hegemon. And so I think that with the story of migration, most people migrate to regional hegemons. They don't migrate to the Londons, the Parises, the New Yorks, right? The Los Angeleses. They migrate to more regional centers. And so even I think there was a different sense of what a man had achieved if he was coming from Ouagadougou, if he was coming from Niamey in Niger or Burkina Faso, then if he was coming from Abidjan, right? Then the city was maybe too small for him, and I should be in Paris. But if you're coming from a smaller center and then you're going there, then there's a different sense of making it. So, but yeah, I mean, for many of them, it was still the dream, and what I would hear is El Dorado was the West, was the US. They would say to me, maybe if I was Canadian, they would have said Canada, but certainly there was an El Dorado that was elsewhere.
We've all heard the data about the youth population in Africa being the youngest growing, biggest growing, largest growing population in the world at the moment. What are going to be the possibilities, opportunities, or situations that young Black men in a city like Abidjan are going to confront going forward, again, as wage labor becomes less and less, and there are many more of them in that context?
I mean, we need to think of a world beyond work. So there's a scholar who writes about the universal wage,
Right.
and how can we think about a post-work economy? And the problem with thinking about a universal wage is that is often predicated on a role of citizenship. So we're still dealing with an idea of who's in and who belongs and who doesn't. And the scholar is James Ferguson, by the way. He has a book, Give a Man a Fish. And there's a really great chapter that kind of unpacks the masculinity issue and how many people in the modern world actually haven't worked, right? This relationship to salaried work is actually been more of an exception across time and space. But it's and we're also dealing with climate crisis and things that are making cities, certain places, harder to be in. So what we're going to be dealing with is more and more economic migrants, right? We need to think locally of more creative ways to find worth and value. And I think that's a politics, and it's also a gender politics for the reasons I mentioned in the very beginning about masculinity is threatened. And so against perhaps logic, right? And logic is, of course, constructed. Against logic, there's still this aspiration to be something in a world where that thing is disappearing, that breadwinning is disappearing, right? So there needs to be creative solutions, but there's also going to be a lot of economic migrants, and they don't get the same open doors as refugees, certainly not as Ukrainian refugees, right? There's a very different treatment of them, and that's a geopolitical. It's a geopolitics.
You obviously, like we all do, go into our research with certain kind of assumptions about what we're going to find, right? Were there anything in the conversations that you had, with some of the men that you talked to in the context of your research, were there any things that really surprised you in terms of what you witnessed or what you experienced?
Surprises. I mean, one thing about the media, they were much more inclined to believe the media than to believe me. When I would say things about how difficult it was for Black men in the United States, and certainly I would be remiss to not contextualize the purchase of media and the power of Black men in media without also recognizing the George Floyd kind of power of recognition, right? Of the video that went around the world and caused protests around the world, and we're in another such moment now. So certainly there is evidence, very, very powerful evidence. And I mean, when I was there, Rodney King, that had happened, the generation before I was there. And at the same time, there was the imaginary of the stardom, and if I would tell men, and everything was pixelated, right? Everything went through a media circuit. So it was almost like you pick and choose what you want to believe and what you want to know, right? And so if I would say that it's very oppressive to be a Black man in the United States, they would say, but we have Jay-Z, right? We've seen the videos and we know the cars that they have, and we know, and I would actually have men say, I want to live like them, what I see. And I mean, they do live like that. It's not just the videos, but most Black men don't live like that, right? So there was, I don't know if I should have been surprised, but it was surprising to see how authoritative the media was, much more than this graduate student, here doing field work, and this is what I have to say. And it's like, but you're not authoritative, right?
I mean, how much do you think gender played into that? Would the response have been different if, say, it was a Black male academic and researcher who was asking these questions, right? Who in some ways looked like the embodiment of these images that they're consuming?
That's a very good question. I haven't thought about that, about whether or not they would have believed. I've certainly imagined, right, different positionalities, but not at that axis. I think maybe yes and maybe no. Because there's somebody like Didier Gondola is just a fantastic scholar who's written several books about more Congo, Kinshasa, and there's a movement of Congolese dandies called sapeurs, who are very well documented among anthropologists. So actually in the end of my book, the conclusion, it also has a Guinness ad I talk about with these sapeurs, and part of they have an adventure, and it's known as an adventure to Brussels or to Paris, depending on if it's Congo Brazzaville or Congo Kinshasa. And what he writes about is that in an earlier era, you would come back, and certainly it's well documented that people who come back, right, they have expectations to distribute, right? That you've been in El Dorado and you're supposed to provide, and we see that also with immigrants, and before they leave with remittances, you're living in horrible conditions, but you're sending everything you have back to your family. But there was also kind of a story that would be told in maybe a prior generation of how great it was, even if it wasn't great, because you don't want to say, well, actually, I was a janitor in Paris. Actually, this is what I was really doing. You want to say, yeah, this was, I was living at large. But there are so many people who've left now that it's hard to keep that up, right? We know enough about how hard it is, that is a story that is still, that is no longer as able to be purchased, but you still have almost every conversation I would have at the end of it, who do you know in the US Embassy? How I still have people on Facebook who will say to me, I'm trying for the lottery again, praise be God that I will get the lottery this year, in the middle of George Floyd protests. Right. Praise be God that I can come to the country, right? So I don't know if I'd been a Black man that would have fundamentally changed things, as far as, because it's hope again, right? You're holding on to a promise that you will be something bigger than what your life is unfolding to be. And does any individual, is that possible for any individual to negate that promise?
One of the things I really appreciated about this book and your work and your writing in particular is as you tell these stories, there are always these nuggets and these kernels that elucidate so many other different kinds of aspects in relationship to Blackness, its devaluing, its explication, et cetera. And I'm going to read one of those to you because it's my favorite in the book, and I can't wait to cite it in my own work. But you write, devaluing Blackness satisfied explicitly capitalist logics of imperial expansion in its accordant racialized social stratification. The Black body was reified for its labor power and commodified for its difference, implying a deficit of full personhood. Blackness constituted a global law of value that embodied a permanent state of extractability, exploitability, and ultimately disposability. Can you spend a little time just unpacking that for the audience?
So, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I was doing was kind of, hinting at that double commodification, right? So this commodification as property, but also a commodification of value in other ways, right? Of the idea of Blackness, and that we can't understand how important the role of Blackness is, and I think it's, as I say this, and this wasn't in that passage, but it needs to be countered with Blackness is a source of hope, right? I was mentioning hope before. It's a source of empowerment. It's a source of beauty, right? There's a whole political agenda that comes with Blackness, but to understand that the very incorporation of Blackness into the world capitalist system was as a negation, as an emptying out, to render the humanity of the enslaved right, inhumane, right? So at the core of the invention of Blackness was a devaluation for the purpose of capitalist exchange, for the purpose of imperial expansion, right? And a lot of the literature on Blackness for good reasons, but certainly scholars like Jemima Pierre, and I'd like to put myself among there as well, with my work, are speaking about how Blackness is also manifest in Africa, because the site for talking about Blackness has been, if we think about Black Atlantic as far as, I like to think about it as a global, going across both sides of the Atlantic, including the continent, but many people exclude the continent from the idea of Black Atlantic. So there's a privileged site for thinking about Blackness from the site of loss. Right. So Pierre describes it as roots and routes, right? That there's a creating or a forging of a new identity. And certainly there's a lot of conversation among, Africana scholarship about what was lost, what was rupture, what was continuity in that slave passage. But to think about also how similar processes were at play and necessarily at play on the continent with the colonizing mission, right? And here, I'll nod to Walter Rodney, who talks about how the slave economy and that experience was fundamental for paving the way to colonize Africa. That it was debilitating for societies there. And so we have to think about continuity, and we have to think also about imperial expansion and processes of negation. And so even where there wasn't the working the Black body to death, as you saw, when the slave trade was alive and well, and it cost less to purchase another human being than to reproduce, than to support and nourish a pregnant woman, right? When you had, lifespans of maybe 7 years, you had, so thinking about that is a different kind of like Afro-pessimism, a different kind of role of Blackness than on the continent, where you did have interlocutors, right? You did have individuals who were valued in order to guarantee imperial expansion, but they were guaranteed with the idea that you will evolve out of your Blackness, right? And the French example is really powerful there, because the relationship between race and culture was very close. So there was this idea that it's only your skin that's deficient, and then the rest of you will become acculturated to be like us. We will civilize you. And so it was also a negation. It was a different kind of negation, but it was also a negation, and through this devaluing of Blackness.
What's next for you, Professor Matlon?
So I am actually, I just came back to teaching, but I'm up for tenure, so I will be on leave, anticipating, assuming tenure goes through. And thank you. And I will actually be in France next year. I got a fellowship to be able to think and work and write. And I'm interested in the next project, and I've been talking to an editor for about a year now, working through a proposal of Blackness in the Anthropocene. Or if you want to call it, aka from Francois Vergès, the Racial Capitalism, but thinking about how Blackness has been held up as that outside, And when I say held up, I mean both from scholars. There's a whole tradition of thinking about Blackness as an alternative possibility for good reasons, but also, in the tradition of thinking of provisions grounds or marronage, right, of people who charted other ways of being in a moment of ecological devastation. What does that hold for us? And so, to borrow from a scholar I admire greatly, Abdul Simon, he writes about this possibility and precariousness of Blackness. And so I really want to explore that in the Anthropocene literature, to look at ecological change, to think about relations of, both what people have written about provision grounds and marronage, but also think about the informal, the underground, a lot of that scholarship that's also in sub-Saharan Africa, cities and in African cities, about what it's like to live outside, and to encourage us to sit with the discomfort of possibility that has been forged out of precarity. Because I think that it can be very dangerous to just celebrate it, when all of this mode of being, of surviving, was because people were pushed so far to the edge that they were expelled from the terms of the terms of thriving, right? They were surviving, but they weren't thriving. So that's what's next for me, is thinking about the ecological dimension in this kind of very precarious moment that we are all in.
Abdul Simon writes of a man among other men, really as a question of what does it mean to be a Black man been addressed so astutely. Matlon brilliantly explores the structural mechanisms producing consent to an inclusionary exclusion and converting seeming resistance into racial capitalism into complicity. Thank you for joining us today, Professor Matlon.
Thank you so much, Dr. Neal.
Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black